Hi guys, welcome to the first of our series of video classes. So I'm going to try to keep the videos here relatively short, preferably under 10 minutes. I know it's really tough to sit around and watch a video that's too long, so we're going to try to, I've got a stopwatch here and I'm going to try to finish it up before 10 minutes, hopefully well under 10 minutes. So we're going to pick up where we left off in class, and the last thing I think we talked about, or the thing we're about to talk about, is global variables. So global variables and global constants. So a global variable is a variable that's created by an assignment statement written outside of all the functions. So this, for example, in most of our code right now, we haven't implemented a main function. We've just been writing our code just outside of any function block. So basically, all of our variables to this point have been global variables, which is fine for what we've been doing. But what that means is, so if you declare a variable in outside of a function, that variable can be accessed by any statement in the program file, including from within a function. So if I declare my variable and I don't put it in a function, I can actually use that variable in a function. So if I want to use it as a value, so for example, if I want to use it on the right-hand side of an assignment statement, in other words, as part of a computation, but I can't necessarily assign things to it. So if I want to assign things to the global variable, what I have to do is I have to redeclare it in the function using the syntax global variable name. And if I do that, then I can actually assign values to the global variable that's declared outside of the function itself. So we're going to see some examples of that in just a second. But generally speaking, you should not use global variables. So global variables make your debugging life extremely difficult. A lot of times you'll have a function that will call another function, that will call another function, that will call another function, and somewhere in that hierarchy of function calls, somebody changes a global variable, and you don't know where that happened. You have to track down through the code and try to figure it out and just dig deep in, and you get very unexpected results a lot of times if you use global variables. So it is strongly recommended. In fact, in the programming assignments, you're not allowed to use global variables. It's very, very poor programming. It will make it very hard for you to debug your code. You'll have unexpected changes to things. Just don't use global variables. The other thing about them is if you use global variables, and let's say you write a function that does something that's fairly useful and you use global variables, when you try to use that function in another program, those variables don't necessarily exist, and it will break your function not to have those variables exist. If you need to pass data into a function, you should use parameters. And if you need to get data out of a function, you should use return values, right? So never use global variables when you can use parameters and return values. It makes your program just really hard to understand and really hard for you to debug. All right, so the one case that you should use global variables, or it's okay to use global variables, is when you're declaring things as global constants. So there's not necessarily a syntax for this in Python to declare a constant, so you have to sort of simulate these things. The way you do that is you create a global variable and you do not use the global syntax. You don't say, like, let's say for example you're creating a variable called pi and you're storing the value of pi. It's a common mathematical constant. Maybe you only want to declare it once. So you declare a variable called pi. You say this is a global constant. You do not ever use the syntax global pi in any of your functions, because if you do that, you can modify it, and you should never be modifying the value of a global constant. All right, so let's look at some code that shows you an example of how this stuff works. All right, so here I have a little bit of code, and if you look at it, I have this function called area, and what this does is it uses a constant called pi to calculate the area of a circle. So my function is really simple. It takes one parameter r, which is the area. It says a is equal to pi times r squared, and then it returns the value of a. So in my code here, in my code, I declare this variable pi, and I put it in upper cases, which is what we usually do for constants, and I assign it a value. So I don't ever declare a variable called pi in this area function. If you look at it, there's a variable called pi that we use in our calculation, but we never declared it. And what that is that's this global variable here. And if we run this, we'll see it runs just fine. It calculates the value of the area, which we're not printing out. We're printing out instead the value of pi. So this is pi. We used it in this function. It was completely unmodified. In fact, we can't modify it. So let's try to modify it inside of our function. And let's say we want to make it equal to 7. Now you notice that the IDE has some complaints, right? The IDE says we have a shadow name pi. This variable shadows the name pi from the outer scope. And what that means is we were essentially trying to, what we're doing here is we're declaring a new variable called pi. And that new variable replaces the old variable in our function from the global variable. So we can't access the global variable anymore. We've aliased it. This is a new variable with the same name. And so when we do our calculation, let's demonstrate this. Let's call print and print the area of this. So let's say that it's just 1, because then we ought to get 3.14, right? Because that would just be, it's an easy one. So let's run this, and in fact, you see we get the value 7. So it's using the value 7 for pi instead of the globally declared value for pi. It's replaced the global variable pi with a local variable with the same name, and then we're using that local variable in our calculation, so we're getting the wrong result. So this is probably not what we want. If we actually want to use the variable pi, we actually want to change the value of the variable pi. But you see in here the value of pi is actually not modified, even though we aliased it. This is a new variable with the same name. Changing the value does not change the value of the global variable pi. If we want to change the value of the global variable pi, what we have to do is instead use the syntax global pi, which means that we're going to use pi, we're going to change pi, and pi is going to be a variable that we've declared globally. So in this case, when we run it, we're going to get 7 for the area, which is what we'd expect if we set pi to 7. And then when we print the value of pi, the global variable pi, we see that it's actually been changed from 3.14 to 7, which is a behavior that we wanted, but it's probably not something that you really want to do, right? So again, this is global variables in a nutshell. Use them for constants. If you ever find yourself using the syntax global x, then just stop yourself. You should be passing this in as a parameter, or you should be returning it as a return value, but you should not be using global in your function. You may see people do this sometimes. It's bad programming practice, but you will see this, so you shouldn't be familiar with it. But I strongly recommend that you don't do this. Okay? All right, thanks guys. That's all for this video. Talk to you later.